Well, taking out Maduro had nothing to do with drug trafficking whatsoever. The threat isn't China buying the oil. The threat is Venezuela allowing China to pay for it in Chinese currency. See, the fight that we have is the BRICS countries are no longer trading within the dollar-denominated financial system. So now the Russians are selling China oil and the Chinese are paying for it in yuan. These countries are trading amongst themselves in their own currencies, and at the end of the month, they're net settling in gold. That's a direct threat to the prosperity of the United States because we have $38 trillion in debt. So we have no cards that we can play economically. Well, short of going to war, the Trump administration has said, you know what? In order to increase our bargaining position relative to China, let's just take control of the resources China needs.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Crime and Entertainment. Returning guest, Pierre Rausini. Pete, how you doing, my friend?
Hello, good evening. I'm doing well.
Glad to have you back as always. Look, the world has been captivated by the news out of Venezuela with the capture of I don't think he's the sitting president, correct? He was not the president over there.
He's what was characterized as the de facto ruler.
De facto ruler. Okay. So he was captured and his wife brought back to the United States. Now, there's a lot of stuff going on in the news, a lot of misinformation. A lot of people believe it's to gain control of the oil. A lot of people believe it's to kind of help put a dent in, some of the criminal activities. But I figured there was no better guy to bring on than you to kind of break this down. Give us a little overview of what's happened, why this, was important, and what kind of goes on in Venezuela with all these kind of things. You got a very unique knowledge of the subject.
Well, sure. A lot of Americans don't have very much familiarity with Venezuela.
Right.
And 25 years ago, essentially, a socialist type dictator named Hugo Chavez was able to take control of the country. And prior to that, like last time I was in Venezuela was a few years before Chavez's reign. And in the early 1990s, Venezuela was beautiful. I mean, it was the third wealthiest country in the Western Hemisphere. The US, Canada, Venezuela. It's sitting on literally the world's largest proven reserve of oil. In addition to having enormous wealth in resources, minerals. And so this should be a country that should be hitting on all cylinders. And yet, unfortunately, over the course of the past 25 years, the country's been literally just driven into the ground. And with respect to the drug trafficking element, the individuals that took over control in the late 1990s had an ideological bent where they were on the hardcore side of socialism, not the Norwegian or the Israeli version of socialism, the Latin American autocratic type. Mm-hmm. And they had an ideological affinity with recently the Colombian pardoned president of Honduras, Cali. Right. Those were just who'd gotten charged and convicted in connection with 400 metric tons. Separatist and corrupt structure within Honduras that were also getting a percentage.
Trump pardoned the guy
and so,
from
in order to assist these
and then
left-wing groups,
go in and take capture of the guy in Venezuela.
Trump's reasons were sound, and in order to support those individuals, they allowed them to begin trafficking the United States Venezuela as a way to raise money to support their particular movement against China. They could also hide their people in Venezuela away from, for the first time, Colombians' abilities to get to them. End of the World War II. They're also able to stash weapons. And so what initially began as helping their fellow, we found ourselves in a circumstance where socialist revolutionaries, another country, demonstrated over the course of the next 2.5 decades, devolved into what, prior to Mr. Maduro's arrest, Venezuela was a critical nexus in the worldwide drug trade. But before we get to that, it's just as the situation economically deteriorated over the course of the past 25 years, the regime in Venezuela essentially adopted the same model that's been in place now in Mexico for decades. And in Mexico, it's referred to as La Plaza. And it's a mechanism by which the elite within Mexican society, political, military, law enforcement elite, are able to profit from the drug trade without getting their hands dirty. Well, the Venezuelans essentially took the Mexican model and supercharged it. See, in Mexico, they primarily provide they sell impunity. Mm. Venezuela went beyond selling simply impunity. They went to actually facilitating the operations.
Wow.
And so, for instance, and the United States has characterized the Venezuelan operation as the Cartel de los Soles, the Cartel of the Suns. Well,
yep.
That's not accurate. The U.S. government has this practice of trying to take situations that are much more nuanced and boiling it down to like a sixth grade narrative. Mm-hmm. Whereas it's not a hierarchy. It's not a cartel structure at all. It's basically state level corruption. And even the term corruption is a little bit of a misnomer because corruption implies a deviation from otherwise honest or ethical behavior. Mm-hmm. Well, if the entire system is corrupt, it's no longer corruption. It's just that's how they conduct their affairs. The entire country has been corrupted over the course of the past 25 years. And so where it becomes prevalent with respect to the trafficking operations, as the situation deteriorated in Venezuela, they began allowing for the country to turn into a marketplace. See, what people don't appreciate is that in Colombia and even in Mexico, there is a very robust American law enforcement and intelligence gathering apparatus. In Colombia, there are still military advisors in the country. Mm-hmm. Consequently, you have to be careful when you're meeting for the purposes of putting together your transactions, making payments, these things. You want to be in a venue where you don't have to worry about Western law enforcement. Back in the 1990s, much of the transactions were taking place in Mexico. Now, Mexico's a hell of a lot better than Los Angeles, but nevertheless, there's still a significant law enforcement presence in Mexico, particularly because much of the product that leaves from Venezuela goes to Europe. The European markets are much more lucrative than the U.S. market. Mm-hmm. And so for the Europeans to travel to Mexico, it's risky because now you're flying into Mexico City. They're flagging individuals coming into the country. And between Mexican law enforcement and American law enforcement, they're able to gather a lot of intel. Doesn't mean that Mexicans are going to act on it and arrest the people, but the problem for the Europeans is if it's a German trafficking group or Italian trafficking group or a Spanish group sends representatives to go meet with either the Mexicans or the Colombians, well, in Mexico, if the Americans catch wind of that, they'll feed that information to law enforcement in Germany. Well, they'll get knocked off. These are first world law enforcement agencies. Whereas with respect to Venezuela, 15 miles off the coast of Venezuela is a Dutch territory called Aruba. Any member of a European Union, any citizen of a European country can travel to Aruba visa-free. So now that means you're not crossing any customs or anything. So you just fly to Aruba. Once you get to Aruba, now you take a boat, just shuttle it into Venezuela. They can't even prove you went into the country. So now once you're in Venezuela, you don't have to worry about the DEA because the DEA has no presence in Venezuela. There's no American military personnel in Venezuela. So the Venezuelan government initially adopted the posture like, look, come do your business here. It's safe. We're going to take a cut for operating what is essentially a bazaar and providing the security, which is enormous within the trafficking world because now people are able to make moves freely. And it'd be difficult later on for the government to prosecute because you can't even prove I was in the country.
Right. So that they're providing a safe haven of sorts to come there and do your business, and they get a percentage of all deals.
Yeah, and yes, that's been the constant over the course of the 20 years. Then within the state corrupt system, you have elements of the Venezuelan military that have taken it to a different degree where they're saying, okay, well, we are going to allow you to use Venezuela as a launching pad. So once the product leaves Colombia, there's essentially two different operations place, the American side and the European side. Now, for the American side, this is primarily distribution in the United States is primarily controlled by Mexicans, and primarily Sinaloa and Jalisco New Generation. Well, the way they get a good chunk of their product is the overland importation route right up through Latin America. So the product will leave Colombia, shoot through Panama, shoot through Costa Rica, shoot through Nicaragua, shoot through Honduras, Guatemala, then it hits Mexico. And then from Mexico, it's got to go 2,000 miles from Mexico, Guatemala border, all the way to Los Angeles, which is their distribution hub here in the United States, the primary base of operations. And so you've just got to need a long network where they can just come right up the landmass. Obviously, that doesn't work with respect to Europe. Now, with respect to the United States, there are various ways to get the product, though. So 20 years ago, when Sinaloa was at its heyday, which was essentially two and a half times bigger than what the cartel was prior to the implosion a year and a half ago. Well, the Jalisco faction of the Sinaloa cartel was led by two particular groups, two families. One was the family of the drug lord Nacho Coronel, and the second was the family of the drug lord Armando Valencia. By the mid-2000s, Armando Valencia had been knocked off. Lobo Valencia had taken over. Well, the Valencias, working in conjunction with the Coronels, was the Jalisco faction of the Sinaloa cartel, which today is Jalisco New Generation. This is how big Sinaloa was. Take all of Jalisco New Generation, add it in. That was just one faction of the predecessor of Sinaloa group. It was just massive. Well, the Jalisco faction, through Lobo Valencia, had standing arrangements with corrupt customs officials at the port in Manzanillo in the Mexican state of Colima, which is the largest port on the Pacific coast. And so the standing arrangement was $1 million to get any container, shipping container, with those 40-foot cargo shipping containers, into the country without being inspected. And so so Jalisco had the Mexican side locked up. Well, in Venezuela, they could assure that the product was loaded onto the containers. This was essentially a bulletproof operation. Mm-hmm. You don't have to worry about law enforcement on the Venezuelan side. And the corrupt customs people in Mexico take care of it on the back end. And so they were able to just ship massive quantities of coke from the Venezuelan ports through commercial shipping to the port in Manzanillo. Now, other factions of the Sinaloa group, such as Zambada's faction, they used a maritime operation to supplement the overland land route. See, the thing is, they never put all their eggs in one basket, so they have multiple systems. Mm-hmm. That way, if any one of them gets taken down, the other ones are still operational. And by having a spectrum, you're able to spread thin law enforcement resources. Well, in addition to the maritime operation coming through shipping, they had the maritime operations with sailing vessels and fishing vessels. And this is where you see like the boats that Trump was blowing out of the water. Those go-fast boats, they'll get loaded up with, let's say, 1 to 3 tons. They'll shoot out of Venezuela, and they'll rendezvous with, let's say, a yacht, leaving Aruba on its way to Cancun. And so once they're out in international waters, they meet with the go-fast boat, and that's where you see, like, there was, on the first one, I think they blew up, the first or second one where I saw the video, there was like an 11-man team. Mm-hmm. It doesn't take 11 men to operate those boats. It's a 2-man operation. You got the guy who's the driver, the pilot, and then you get the individual who's the navigator. The other 9 people, those are just worker bees. Yeah. Like those are essentially just, broke guys that are living in fishing villages who, hey, you want to make $5,000? Like for them, it's just a chance to come, a quick $5,000 score, which is a huge amount of money for some poor Venezuelan guy. Right. And so the 9 guys that are the worker bee detail on those go-fast boats, they're the ones who, when they park next to the yacht, you'll have like 5 of the worker bees will go over to the yacht. And so you'll have the 4 guys that remain on the Go Fast boats, they're throwing the bales into the water. Like if you saw the bales, you're going to see that they'll have like 3 bales tied up with ropes.
Mm-hmm.
So they'll throw those into the water. Meanwhile, the guys that are on the yacht are using those long fishing hooks, those long, like they use essentially like for like lobster collections. Okay. So then they'll just start pulling them out of the water. So you have 2 guys working the hooks, pulling the bales out of the water. The other 2 guys on the yachts are running those bales to whatever area of the boat they're going to store it. And then the 5th guy will be there properly storing everything to make sure the boat remains seaworthy. Mm-hmm. And so that 9-man team are just transferring 1, 2, sometimes 3 tons. And so for the Mexicans, they'll take that, either the sailing yacht or the motor yacht, shoot it up towards the Mexican state of Quintana Roo, where you're going to have either Cancun, Tulum, very affluent area of Mexico with a lot of tourism and a lot of yachting. So now you can pull the boat up off the water, boom, then you'll have a little fishing boat come out, transfer the boat to the fishing boat, and they'll smuggle it into the country under the guise of returning home with the catch. Mm-hmm. And then Zambada's people will take possession of the product in Cancun, and then the overland route that's used for the same overland route that's used to transport from Latin America through Mexico up through that whole chain is the same group that's going to be used to take it all the way through Mexico, essentially. Okay. So that's the Mexican operations to get the product to the United States with respect to maritime operations. Another aspect in Venezuela that they can provide is they can guarantee that product taken to the airport will be put on commercial airliners without being inspected. So whether it's commercial airliners or private jets. Now, the reason why this was important is because the same Valencias that were part of the Coronel Valencia Alliance, they controlled Jalisco for the Sinaloa cartel. Today, they're called the Jalisco New Generation. Well, they had a standing arrangement with corrupt customs officials at the International Airport in Mexico City. Well, those compromised officials could ensure that any loads either secreted in the belly of commercial airliners or on private jets can swiftly be taken through customs without interference from law enforcement.
Wow. So they got carte blanche to load commercial airliners with product.
Oh, yeah.
And get it through.
They know, just in the context of, let's say, a 737 is flying from Caracas to Mexico City. Well, when the plane arrives in DF, you're going to have, 185 passengers. And, the bulk of that plane below is used for cargo. Right. It's not luggage.
Yeah.
DHL may have stuff on there, or UPS may have stuff. So they just have a lot of commercial shipping takes place within the context of civilian airliners. Mm-hmm. And so, yes, they're able to just push through tons through commercial airliners, or they can load up a Gulfstream, put in, 4 or 5 tons in a Gulfstream, shoot that up. I mean, it was just wide open. And up until 2012, the beneficiary of this operation was Sinaloa. In 2011, Jalisco New Generation the Coronel Valencia group broke away, formed Jalisco New Generation. And since 2012, Jalisco has had control of the ports and the airport. Sinaloa is now simply relegated to the overland route or the maritime route coming up through the fishing boats. But yeah, going into Mexico, it was just wide open. But all of that is possible because of the backing of the state government in Venezuela. It's not that the government is involved in trafficking. It's they make sure your loads don't get interfered with.
Essentially, they're offering a big insurance policy for traffickers.
Yes, enormous. And now, on the other side of the equation, now you've got the European operations. Because you have to understand, let's say Sinaloa goes down to Colombia. They meet in Venezuela and say, hey, we need 20 metric tons. Well, if you're buying 20 metric tons at a time, that's 20,000 kilos. You're going to pay somewhere in the neighborhood of $2,000 a key. Mm-hmm. So you're talking ballpark $40 million. Now, those 20 metric tons have to get, of course, transported north so they can bring it to the United States for sale. And we've already discussed how the Mexicans are getting it to the U.S. And that product, when it gets to the United States, most of that product is sold in Mexico to American-based customers, and the American-based customers take delivery in the U.S. That portion that isn't sold in Mexico is sold in the United States, primarily by a handful of distributors in Los Angeles. At their peak 20 years ago, Sinaloa had maybe 15 distributors in LA that handled 80% of all the cocaine for Sinaloa distributed on American soil. Okay, now the product being sold in LA will have a price of somewhere in the neighborhood of $15,000 a kilo. So you're sourcing it for $2,000 a key. It's ultimately getting sold for $15,000 a key. But that's not all profits because every one of those countries are taking a bite. Recently, Trump pardoned the president of Honduras,
right,
who'd gotten charged and convicted in connection with 400 metric tons.
And that was under the Biden administration that he got charged with.
He was prosecuted and convicted under, I believe, yes, under the Biden administration. And Trump recently pardoned the guy. And with those 400 metric tons coming through the country, the corrupt structure within Honduras was getting a percentage. Mm-hmm. And so we don't know what the exact breakdown is. Like the president before the guy that got pardoned, the guy who got pardoned was named Hernandez. The president before him was a gentleman named Lobo. Well, I know Lobo's son. Throughout the course of the pandemic, when we were in federal prison, literally, if you walked out of my cell across the range was the president's son. Like every day he was over at my cell, we'd having coffee, BSing, how's your family, catching up on the news. We were locked down for the 15 months really hard.
Right.
And so I got a pretty good idea of how the operations were structured in Honduras because I got the bullshit with the guy all the time.
Right.
And literally the Honduran authorities were providing essentially the same service where they're guaranteeing safe passage.
Okay.
And so for every 20 metric ton that shipment that comes through, let's say they're going to charge $300 a kilo or $400 a kilo. And so, but when it left Colombia, it was $2,000. Well, if you wanted to buy that same 20 metric tons in Panama, you're not paying $1,800 a key. You're paying $2,200 a key. Mm-hmm. And if you want to buy it in Guatemala, you're going to pay more. And if you want to buy it in Cancun, you're going to pay more. And if you're going to buy it in Tijuana, you're going to pay more. And of course, you're really going to pay a lot more in LA. Mm-hmm. And so everywhere along that chain, these little corrupt governments are all taking a bite.
Yeah.
And so with respect to Venezuela, the reason why Venezuela is so critical, particularly with respect to Jalisco New Generation, is because they went heavy into Europe. Because that same kilo that's got a wholesale price in LA for $15,000 per is getting wholesaled in Berlin for $35,000, Milan for $35,000. Some of the smaller European countries, in Estonia, there's reports that they were paying $200,000 a kilo.
Damn.
Now, granted, those aren't large markets, but you're talking, the European Union is an enormous market. It's got more people than the United States, is very wealthy, and it's 27 or so little countries. Mm-hmm. And so the Europeans were able to capitalize on an ability to either meet with the Mexicans or meet with the Colombians, but all that takes place in Venezuela.
Well, I know that was a big thing. A lot of people that I've seen on social media was questioning why would Trump pardon the guy from Honduras and then turn around and go in and take capture of the guy in Venezuela. And from the little bit that I did research on that, I didn't dive heavy into him, but I do remember he was charged under the Biden administration. And according to the things that I read, he didn't necessarily have the greatest case against him as far as evidence. And from what I read, that was why Trump pardoned him. But that does beg the question why you would pardon him and then go after another one.
Trump indicated afterwards, look, just so everyone knows where I'm coming from, I'm not some knee-jerk Trump supporter.
Right.
Like, I'm not Republican, quite frankly. I'm not conservative. I'm from California.
Right.
Like, I'm not MAGA. However, Trump's reasons were sound, and it's got nothing to do with the quality of the case against the guy.
Okay.
The United States is currently involved in an existential struggle against China. And last year, for the first time since the end of the World War II, since the beginning of what's essentially the American Empire, we found ourselves in a circumstance where another country demonstrated the ability to cripple the American economy. When Trump and his guys came in, there was a lot of big talk. We're going to put tariffs. Well, everybody folded except China. We put 100%, they put 100%. We want to decouple. They said, fine, we'll decouple. We want to put export controls. They said, fine, we'll put export controls. Well, twice the administration had to cave. On the last time, after Bessent made his deal, the Secretary of the Treasury made his deal with the Chinese, the Trump administration got cute and started putting additional export controls on China. After we'd entered into the agreement, that's when they dropped the nuclear option and said, okay, no more rare earths, no more metal or magnets. Well, within days, the leaders of the defense contractors were going to Washington to tell Trump, hey, we've got enough supplies to build missiles for the next 2 weeks. Then we're done. The United States is not the United States if we don't have military capacity. Mm-hmm. Likewise, the CEOs of Ford, GM, the big manufacturing operations that are still left in the United States, they report to Trump, hey, we have enough magnets to keep the auto production lines going for 3 weeks. Well, China demonstrated that at their discretion, they could cripple our economy. Well, for the first time in our lifetime, an American administration had to take the punch. We agree to take the tariffs down, so now China took the tariffs down. We agree to remove the export controls. They agreed to suspend the export controls for a year. Remember, a year ago, we were saying they're never going to get NVIDIA chips. Now, not only are we taking down the export controls, we're letting them buy the chips. Mm-hmm. And Trump's not just talking about the H100s. He's even saying, hey, you know what? Let's just give them the Blackwells too. Like, they're giving them everything. Why? Because we lost. Mm-hmm. And so the administration is got a 1-year window to put themselves in a position to conduct the negotiations that are going on right now, which is why 6 weeks ago, the Trump administration released a document called the National Security Strategy. Well, the National Security Strategy clearly sets out that the U.S. government is going to focus its efforts on the Western Hemisphere, disentangle our nonsense from Europe, retrench back here. Now, what the administration's goals are is essentially to commandeer control of the natural resources throughout Latin America. China does a tremendous amount of business with Venezuela. 90% of Venezuela's oil goes to China. Argentina, soybeans and all their agricultural groups, much of it goes to China. China has an enormous industry involving electric vehicles. They're the biggest producers in the world. Enormous industry with respect to solar panels. Well, what's the largest producer of lithium? Bolivia. It goes to China. Well, taking out Maduro had nothing to do with drug trafficking whatsoever. This was a naked assertion of American power to let everybody else in the Western Hemisphere know that for you to do business with any country outside of the Western Hemisphere, you will do so on Trump's terms in a manner consistent with U.S. national security interests. Otherwise, you're going to be labeled a narco-terrorist and we're going to come get you. So now, and we know this because the day after they arrested Maduro, Trump clearly states that no other country questioned American dominance in the Western Hemisphere. What he is saying is we own all of the natural resources and we are reintegrating it into the American financial order because the threat isn't China buying the oil. The threat is Venezuela allowing China to pay for it in Chinese currency. See, the fight that we have is the BRICS countries are no longer trading within the dollar-denominated financial system. So now the Russians are selling China oil and the Chinese are paying for it in yuan. The Russians are selling India oil, they're paying for it in rupee. Well, these countries are trading amongst themselves in their own currencies, and at the end of the month, they're net settling in gold, which is why you've seen this massive run up in the price of gold over the course of the last year, because central banks are hoarding gold because they're literally creating an alternate financial system. Right. So early in the administration, Trump says if the BRICS form their own currency, we'll put 100% tariffs on all of them because allowing them to do so would be the equivalent of losing a major war. Well, we lost the war. They didn't create a currency. They're using gold to net settle. And so now that's a direct threat to the prosperity of the United States because we have $38 trillion in debt. There's very little foreign interest in buying our debt. We can't afford any interest rates above 4.7, 4.8%. We saw that when Liberation Day happened. A week later, interest rates spiked. They had to cave. Mm-hmm. So we have no cards that we can play economically. Well, short of going to war, the Trump administration has said, you know what? In order to increase our bargaining position relative to China, let's just take control of the resources China needs. So after they took over Venezuela, Trump said, look, he's got no problem selling oil to China. In fact, he wants to increase the oil getting sold to China. However, China has to buy them from American oil companies and pay for it in American dollars.
Right.
And all those surplus dollars you have at the end of the year, recycle them back into Wall Street through the American bond market. You want to buy soybeans from Argentina? You're going to pay in dollars. Why do you think Trump gave him $46 billion before the election? To make sure that the president's party today is the one in power. Because Argentina, prior, under the previous regime, was petitioning to join BRICS. Venezuela had just offered to join BRICS. Well, the United States could not allow Venezuela, with the largest proven oil reserves, join a currency bloc that is trading outside of the United States. It would have been crippling to the American economy. Like I said, I'm not a knee-jerk Trump person, but I don't understand how this is a partisan issue. Like if you're an American and you're concerned about our standard of living, or you're concerned about the future financial prosperity of the United States, this is a no-brainer. Like everyone should be commending the administration for taking the action.
Right.
Now, where people are getting their panties in a ruffle is because so many people in the United States buy the bullshit and don't want to accept the fact that we are an empire. Mm-hmm. We have been since the end of World War II. It's only now where it's nakedly become necessary to say we dominate the Western Hemisphere. Lithium sales to China, no problem. Pay for them in dollars. Soybeans out of Argentina or Brazil, no problem. Dollars. The administration is acting to protect the dollar-denominated financial system. And if you think inflation is bad now, believe me, if the dollar is no longer the world reserve asset, we're toast.
So how did the guy that he pardoned factor into that? How's that going to?
Because the Honduran government, the individual that was convicted, is still part of the political structure that remains in power.
Okay.
And so basically it's like, hey, look, you know what? Let's cement our relationship with the guys now in charge. So this was essentially him just doing the guy a solid. And we know this because after Trump pardoned the guy, one of the reporters in Washington that had their panties in a ruffle was like, but he's such a bad man. And he's like, and Trump straight up said, he's like, you think he's any different than any of the other guys down there?
Yeah.
Remember, the product's got to go from Colombia to Mexico. But before it gets to Honduras, it's already went through Panama. It's already went through Costa Rica. It's already went through Nicaragua. They're all pigs eating at the narco trough. And so he's no different than anybody else. Now, the guys that we don't get along with, like the leader in Nicaragua, he's a narco-terrorist. But the narcos in Panama, we just ignore their drug activity. We treat this as a law enforcement issue, and we don't focus on the political system. But if you're on the wrong side of the equation, Nicaragua, Venezuela, Cuba, now you're a narco-terrorist.
Gotcha. So explain the dynamic was with his situation as in power, because from what I understand, he was actually voted out of power, but he refused to leave. Is that correct?
Yes. Well, they've had a long history of running some really shady elections.
Right.
But the most recent one was clearly a loss for the regime. And they simply declared themselves the winner. And so dozens of Western countries don't recognize the legitimacy of the Maduro administration. They acknowledge that they're the de facto ruler. That doesn't mean they're legitimate.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So was there a beef? Because this is honestly the first time that I'd heard that guy's name when they went over there and got him. And then you see all these videos pop up With him, I guess, daring them to come get him. I don't even know if that's accurate because so many people can manipulate stuff through AI nowadays. But was there a back and forth before this took place of him daring the United States to come get him? That was true?
Sure.
Well, he fucked around and found out,
Yeah.
didn't he?
Yeah. No, he behaved in a manner that was, look, he was offered an opportunity to go to asylum in November, I believe it was. Like, just leave.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't want to relinquish. And the fact of the matter remained is somebody was going to be made an example of. He just was foolish enough to stick around. But this was going to happen no matter what. Like, in fact, today in the New York Times, I just printed out the article before coming on air where it says that the U.S. will be indefinitely controlling oil out of Venezuela. Like, they're no longer even a sovereign nation.
Right.
It's just straight up naked imperialism. And this is, I think, what troubles a lot of people, particularly those people that are on the more left side of the spectrum, because they've lived their entire lives thinking that the United States doesn't engage in this type of behavior. But we have throughout our history.
And I'll say it's probably been done, definitely, like you said, throughout our history, maybe a little bit more under the radar, cloak and dagger, if you will, things to hide. It's what was really going on. Yeah. Trump is just that guy that doesn't really give a shit. He'll tell you exactly what he's doing.
Well, one, Trump does, he is uncharacteristic of most politicians. Sometimes he actually says the quiet part out loud.
Yeah.
But in this particular time, he was sending a message to other leaders in Latin America. As the Trump team meets with the Chinese team to negotiate right now the new status quo trading arrangement after the end of this 1 year period, China came in with all the leverage. Well, Trump just reset the playing field.
Right.
Because now he can come in and act magnanimously. Well, of course, we're going to allow you to continue buying Venezuelan oil. But the implicit threat is if you cut off the rare earths and the magnets, well, you're not going to be able to get the oil, and you're not going to be able to get the lithium, and you're not going to be able to get the bauxite, and forget about getting soybeans or dairy products or beef products. China has to import food. 1/3 to 1/2 of their food gets imported into the country. You got 1.5 billion people. Well, they need South America and, quite frankly, North American supplies. Well, Trump can now threaten them with access to these markets.
And I mean, essentially, I've got a terrible habit of, even in the business world, I try to put everything in perspective with I don't want to say just specifically the drug game, but anything illegal, right? And it's essentially like a drug game. Like, you've got somebody that's threatening to cut off your product. Well, then you're going to go and get anything that they need, rely on, or whatever, and you're going to control that from them to make sure that they don't cut off your product. Essentially, that's kind of what this is. And it's like that on a broad scale. Trump was a smart son of a bitch for doing that.
No, this was brilliant. Absolutely brilliant move, because he was able to manufacture some bargaining chips. And now the parties are negotiating on a more relative basis with respect to they need each other. Like, this is going to cement the relationship with China.
Yeah.
Because as far as Trump's concerned, they want access to Chinese capital. Well, so long as China has to engage in all this commerce with Latin American countries for the natural resources and pay in dollars, well, Trump can say, we've got no problem allowing you to do that. Take some of those surplus dollars and recycle them through the American bond market. So Washington wins. Wall Street wins. China's going to get what they want and kind of slow down that de-dollarization process. You've heard that term de-dollarization a lot in the business world.
Right.
Well, that's been accelerating. And so now you see at least Venezuela is not going to be able to join the BRICS. And every other country down there knows that their commercial activity has to take place within the context of, American national security interests. And when you hear the administration saying national security, they're not talking military.
Right.
They're talking financial. And so this was like I said, a brilliant move on the administration's part. I think it's totally misguided for people to act as if it was somewhat inappropriate, unless you want to have to concede that China is going to become preeminent. Because at this point, if you go into a negotiation with the counterparty that holds the leverage, you have two choices: either capitulate or we go to war.
Right.
And I understand today, things are pretty charged politically. When 100 years from now, 150 years from now, historians are going to look back at this moment and say, that's the move that Trump did to stop World War III. And like I said, I'm not some Trump supporter, but in this particular instance, it was absolutely amazing the move they pulled off. Now, however, they've come out from beneath the curtain. Everybody knows naked imperialism.
Mm-hmm.
And once you take that position, you no longer have any friends.
You got to stand on it.
You have a lot of supplicants, and they're going to smile in your face. They're all looking for an opportunity to stick a knife in your neck. Mm-hmm. So now he has to maintain this posture going forward.
And a lot of people were making a big deal of it too. Like you said, I don't think people grasp really the in-depth detail and reasoning, which you've explained here. But a lot of people was like, he didn't have congressional approval, but you don't necessarily need congressional approval with that. I mean, when Obama killed Osama bin Laden, he didn't have congressional approval. I think when he invaded Libya to kill Gaddafi, I don't think he had congressional approval. So you don't necessarily have to have it.
They had congressional approval to go get bin Laden, of course. Shortly after 9/11, legislation was passed authorizing the president to do anything necessary to take on al-Qaeda. In this particular circumstance, and this is, we have a very legalistic society. And so in order to avoid having to deal with Congress, this is where the drug issue becomes relevant, because they charge Maduro, and now they're characterizing the effort to go grab him as a law enforcement action. So although it was Delta Force that went in to get him, the people that apprehended him, they happen to have 2 DEA agents on the team. The DEA arrested Maduro with the assistance of 150 aircraft.
Yeah.
And a couple of Delta Force squadrons.
But they get the cover.
Yes, and that's why it was just, it's a charade that the United States has been playing now for decades in Latin America. They used the drug issue as a pretext to provide either military assistance or to assert control. Like this became, the event that happened that really kicked this off was in the late 1970s, when you had the Sandinista forces in Nicaragua toppled the American-friendly autocratic regime. Mm-hmm. And so now from the American perspective, we'd lost Cuba in the 1960s. Now we'd lost Nicaragua, because these were both Soviet satellites. So to the American power structure, the Russians are on the move. And so when Nicaragua fell, the United States needed a pretext to make sure that the other countries in Latin America didn't fall, because there was a lot of left-wing sympathizers in El Salvador, in Honduras, in Guatemala, in Mexico. This was, in Colombia, that's what FARC was. Mm-hmm. And so when the Reagan administration went to Congress saying, hey, we need money to stop the commies reasserting the old domino theory from Vietnam, Congress refused to give them the money. And so then they came back with this quote unquote war on drugs. Well, when Nixon declared the first war on drugs in 1972, 80% of the money was dedicated towards addressing demand side issues. Only 20% went to law enforcement. When Reagan declared the modern war on drugs 10 years later, that process, the allocations flipped. 80% of the money went to disrupting supply side, law enforcement matters, with only 20% targeting demand. Well, that supply side attack provided the cover necessary to start saying, okay, well, we're going to put military advisors in those countries. So today we've got military bases in Guatemala. That base was built in 1982, ostensibly to assist with counter-narcotics operations. But in reality, they were there to make sure that the Guatemalan government didn't topple. Mm-hmm. And so the authority, we were able to put people in Panama, put people in Honduras, people in Guatemala. But the justification was, these aren't military advisors. They're not there in conjunction with military at all. They're just training the Guatemalans in counter-narcotics operations. So now we were able to get arms, weapons, men, material into those countries without having to go through Congress dealing with us mobilizing forces in Latin America after we just lost to the commies in Vietnam. And so this has been the charade the American government has been using for decades now, where they justify military actions under the guise of counter narcotics. And so the arrest of Maduro was the same thing. He did have an indictment against him.
And that was put on him, I think, under the Biden administration. The indictment was put on.
There was 2 indictments. There was one brought initially, and then the recent one was just a few days earlier. And I got the indictment right here. And it charges a whole number of individuals. However, the 2 that they went and got was him and his wife. Like, the regime is still in power.
Right.
The Secretary of Defense that's been indicted in the United States is still the Secretary of Defense.
Yeah.
The Interior Ministry minister that's been indicted in the U.S., he's still in charge of law enforcement. Like, these are the people that the Trump administration is working with. See, the U.S., like all Latin America, well, the U.S. is a little different. The U.S. views narcos in 2 categories. You're a good narco if you're on Team USA.
Mm-hmm.
If you're on Team China, you're a bad narco. Well, so long as the Secretary of Defense in Venezuela keeps his forces stand down, maintains security in the country, and allows the American government to run wild in the country, they're not going to care about the drug activity.
They're a good narco.
They're good narcos.
And America, pretty much, I mean, they were able to go in there, infiltrate, get him, get his wife, get out without any casualties to our side, which I think does speak volumes to the operation as well and as quickly as it was pulled off. But I think that does set an example of what we can do and are obviously willing to do if someone is not going to play ball. I've been seeing in the news that Russia is upset about this. What have you read anything about what Russia's stance on it is?
Well, Russia is the Chavez-Maduro era has resulted in the United States losing its position in Venezuela with respect to oil exploration and extraction. Mm-hmm. Like only one company is down there with a waiver. And so the businesses that are doing the bulk of the extraction are actually Russian firms. So the Russians are extracting the natural resources, the Chinese are buying them. And so from the Russian perspective, they want to bring Venezuela into BRICS because that $17 trillion worth of oil they have in the ground can be used to collateral to backstop a lot of financial activity. Mm-hmm. And of course, the Russians are going to lose the contracts because Trump's going to kick their oil companies out.
So we cut them out of the equation. That's why they're pissed.
Yeah, so by doing this, not only does Russia get screwed, China gets screwed in the sense that they're not going to get access to the natural resources in their own currency.
Right. They've got to pay for it with American currency, which, like you said, will funnel back in through bonds, which will benefit United States taxpayers. Sure. But Russia's just going to get shit out of this whole deal.
They get shafted.
So no wonder they're pissed.
They're pissed off. Yes. And of course, look, if you start with the principle that a ruler can be apprehended simply because somebody charged them, then every ruler in the world is subject to getting apprehended.
Right. So it makes everybody a little uncomfortable.
It makes everybody a little uncomfortable. Now, what's going to be interesting to see is how comfortable are we when they start doing it?
Yeah.
Because China has a very big drug problem.
Yeah. But
that product doesn't go from Mexico to China. It doesn't go from Colombia to China. It goes from Mexico and Colombia to the Philippines. Philippines were a Spanish colony for 400 years. There's a lot of cultural ties between the Philippines and Mexico and the Philippines and Colombia. So now if the United States is blowing Venezuelan boats out of the Caribbean because they're transporting drugs, what happens when the Chinese start blowing Filipino fishing boats out of the water in the South China Sea? Well, the precedent's been set. Or what's to stop the Russians from going and kidnapping Zelensky? Mm-hmm. And so I think a lot of the leaders are concerned only because any country can now play this game saying, oh, we're going to charge him. Well, if the Russians charge Zelensky, the West would go crazy if the Russians kidnapped the guy.
Right.
And so that's I think that but I think that the notion that they're standing up for the international rules-based order is just bullshit.
Yeah, that's all bullshit.
Everybody's just concerned with losing access to the $17 trillion worth of oil.
Yeah.
And also the minerals. There's a lot of illegal mining going on in Venezuela. Well, the Trump administration is currently embroiled in this resource war and essentially economic order war with China. And both sides are scrambling to secure gold with respect to money that they can use to backstop their particular world orders, but most importantly, also silver. So you've seen the price of silver has exploded. Price of gold has exploded. Well, the United States has essentially created an embargo where they want to restrict China's access to silver. The U.S. government recently declared silver a critical metal. And we have a problem because China is the world's second largest producer of silver, and they control either directly or indirectly 70% of silver processing. Well, the United States has one advantage in that the world's largest producer of silver is Mexico. The problem for the U.S. is the silver concentrations in Mexico are located in the states of Sinaloa, Jalisco, Michoacan, Sonora, Zacatecas. This is core cartel territory. And so you're going to see at some point, I'm sure later this year, either the Mexican government actually cripple Jalisco New Generation or American military action undertaken unilaterally going into Mexico to get them. Again, it's got nothing to do with drugs.
Right.
But they're going to use the drug as a pretext because the United States will not allow China to break a critical resource embargo because there are narcos in Mexico extorting the mining interests. And for this entire decade, Jalisco has been extorting.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a caper they pulled off not too long ago where they extorted 200 metric tons of gold and silver.
Damn.
Well, if you stop me, like 200 metric tons, there's 2,200 pounds in a ton. At 200 metric tons, there's 440,000 pounds. At 16 ounces a pound, at $4,000 an ounce, you're talking 1.6 to 2.2 billion dollars in that one heist alone. Like, these guys aren't knocking off the local Wells Fargo branch.
Yeah.
Now, personally, I think that was an inside job because what the Jalisco does is they extort all the mining companies. So when a mining company in Zacatecas report that we produced 20 million ounces of silver last year, no, you produced 25 million, 5 million with the Jalisco.
Yeah.
And so I think they stage these truck hijackings so that the mining companies can then stick it to the insurance company.
Because that's been a thing for a while where gold has been used to wash and launder money, drug money as well.
Yes. Yeah, but again, the American government has treated it as a law enforcement matter. Yeah. It's now become an issue only because, there's a lot of gold, particularly in Venezuela. Well, they want to secure that gold. They want to secure all those resources. They've got rare earths. And so these are natural resources that are crucial to the American financial system, where we're going to be able to either use them to bargain with China or keep them for ourselves. So that we can break free of allowing them to strangle us by threatening to withhold their rare earths.
Right. So we've obviously discussed the perks for this and what it's going to mean for the United States and the benefits we'll reap from it of now having that deal with China in place where they can't use their currency to buy this oil. I think they're going to play ball because they want to buy the oil. Essentially, they're having to use the American dollar instead of their own currency. What do you think could be the biggest downfall to this outside of what you mentioned earlier, to where you say, all right, well, if other countries want to do that to shoot down boats or whatever, what do you think could be some downfalls to this?
The main concern is you no longer have the ability to criticize other countries for nakedly acting in their interest.
Because you did it.
The rules are out. There is no rules-based international order. The U.S. says we control this half of the planet. So now China's going to say, fine, we control Asia. Russia can say, we control Europe. Like in the real world, if you say I can do something and you can't, you better be careful because you're not bulletproof.
Right.
This wouldn't happen. This doesn't happen in the narco world.
Right.
Because in the narco world, people get upset when I say it, but you're never going to meet more honest businessmen. People don't lie. People don't steal. There are no thieves at the high level. Thieves get unalived long before they ever get to that level. And if you make a statement that turns out to be false deliberately and you cost someone money, they're coming for you. So you either better be the biggest, baddest guy on the block, a Mencho type, because there are plenty of people that would love to see Mencho get unalived. Mm-hmm. Or you better treat other people with respect. Because if you think you're going to bulldog people, like I said, nobody's bulletproof. And so you don't see this kind of behavior at the more modest trafficking level. Mm-hmm. At the geopolitical level, the United States had absolutely no alternative at this point.
Right.
And so I think that now, with respect to the drug activity, I don't think that's going to change at all. But with respect to the people for Venezuela, look, this is a huge benefit for the Venezuelans. Like, the American government doesn't care about the Venezuelans. Just like we didn't care about the Afghani women going to school and Iraqi freedom. None of that's all bullshit.
Yeah.
But outside of our benefits, it does work to their benefit because there's no reason why Venezuela should be some decrepit state.
There's a famous movie called Casino with a lot of big name actors. One of my favorite mob movies ever. And towards the end, Joe Pesci has a statement right before he and his brother actually get killed in the cornfield. And he says, it's always the dollar. It's always the fucking dollar. And that's what it's always about. Your opinion real quick, and we'll wrap up with this. Had Trump not made this decision to go in and get him and his wife, what do you think would have been the result? Because as you alluded to earlier, we were very much on the cusp of being phased out by China and a lot of things coming to a stop. What do you think could have happened?
We would have either had to capitulate or it would have been war.
With China?
With China.
And I don't think that's a good outlook. That's not somebody.
Well, the thing is, look, you can't. The American economy, following World War II, we entered into what was denominated the Bretton Woods financial system,
right? Which
was a gold-backed system. The United States defaulted on its debt. Twice in our country's history, we defaulted. People act like that never happened. Of course we did. When Nixon took us off the gold standard, remember, he temporarily suspended. Mm-hmm. What's been 50 some odd years, we haven't reinstated it. And so we didn't honor our debt. A few years later, the American government was able to say, okay, well, we're going to predicate the American financial order on what's called the petrodollar. Well, so long as the world's resources, and in particular oil, the most important, are all denominated in dollars, we're going to be able to continue printing money and running these enormous budget deficits and essentially have the world pay for it. We've had what's referred to as an exorbitant privilege. Well, that privilege crashes the moment the American dollar is no longer the world reserve asset. And this move with China, with Venezuela, has slowed China's move. Now, it's not going to dissuade China from going forward. It's not going to dissuade India because these are nuclear powers. Mm. But he's able to bulldog Colombia. He's already threatening them. That president's now a narco. I'm sure soon Brazilian president's going to be a narco. But it gives a hammer to say, look, slow down this movement. Like those countries that are too big that we can't bully, okay, we'll just create a separate financial order for you guys. You guys do your little BRICS thing. But everybody else, we're not going to allow them to participate in this alternate financial order, even though it would be in that country's interest to do so. We don't care. This is just straight naked imperialism at this point. And the harm that's going to befall us is people are going to start treating us in a manner consistent with how they view, let's say, other hegemonic powers. Mm-hmm.
do you think we make this right with Russia somehow? Because as it's well documented, Trump and Putin do have a long history, to the depths of which I'm not 100% on, but I do know they're friendly of sorts. I mean, they've had numerous conversations. There was a big collusion a while back that Russia helped Trump win, which I don't think that was the case at all. But obviously, they do have a relationship. Do you think they do anything to smooth this over with Russia, being that they kind of cut them out of this deal?
That, yes, of course, because there's a concerted effort. In fact, in this national security document, they clearly indicate that they want to rebuild their relationship with Russia. You know, the people that are really in trouble are the leadership of the European Union. Like, I'll be shocked if by the end of the Trump administration that the European Union in its current configuration exists. Like, there's already reporting in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Trump administration is trying to break it up, like encouraging Czechoslovakia to leave, Hungary to leave, Italy to leave. Because the best we can hope for is being an equal with China with respect to leverage over one another.
Right.
Which means prior to last year, we saw ourselves as the world hegemon. That means we got to control everything. The dollar was perceived as untouchable. Consequently, the United States went along with the European Union forming and allowing the euro to be created. Well, the euro is a reserve currency, nowhere near as big as the dollar, but nevertheless, it gets like 17% of the world's assets are parked in euros. Well, so long as we were getting 100%, we were willing to throw our lackeys in Europe 17%. So now we're getting 83, they get 17. But now that we have what Trump is calling the G2, which is the US and China, that implies we're not getting 100%. That implies we're getting 50%, China gets 50%. Well, all of a sudden, that 17% that Europe is getting when we had 100% of the pie, that 17% now becomes 34% when all we get is 50. Well, we're not going to split that much money with the Europeans. So that's why you've already seen Trump making statements criticizing the European Union. Elon Musk's come out straight out saying we have to break up the European Union, where there's a concerted effort to break the EU so that the euro is no longer gobbling up so much of a percentage of wealth being parked in that euro as an asset. And so if we can break it up to where the Germans go back to the Deutschmark, the Italians go back to the lira, it's basically the U.S. is employing a divide and conquer strategy.
Right.
And so their primary focus is going to be on breaking up the European Union next, which is in Russia's strategic interest. So you can see where the parties, they align, their interests align. And so to answer your question, yes, I see that there's going to be some kind of a deal with Russia predicated upon both sides essentially neutralizing the European Union.
Right. And that makes sense. And it's definitely impacting the stock market a little bit. It's doing well, at least for this week. Sure. A lot of things are doing well.
You're going to see a look. The American economy, nominally in nominal terms, it's doing wonderfully. In reality, we're in a very, very dangerous situation, and you see it reflected in gold. You see it reflected in silver. You know, let's say the spot price for gold in the New York Exchange, COMEX, is at $70 an ounce, ballpark. In the Shanghai market, they're paying $82. So now, if you're narco extorting silver companies in Sinaloa or Jalisco, are you going to sell it to the Americans for $70 an ounce or to the Chinese for 82?
Right.
If you're silver mines in Peru, are you selling them to the Americans at 70 or the Chinese at 82? Well, naturally, businessmen are going to go to where they can get the most profit per unit. Well, Trump has just said, we don't care what the Chinese are paying. You have to deal with the Americans or you're a narco-terrorist.
Not the good narco.
That's not the good narco. And so that's why you see the move against Maduro. It's essentially a raw demonstration of power.
That's what I was about to say. A very big power display.
It's a raw demonstration of power, which is why he was foolish in not taking the opportunity to go live in exile. He could have been retired in, Qatar. He could have gone to Dubai. He could have gone to Turkey. He could have gone to Russia. And like in the end, they may end up commuting the guy's sentence. I can see Trump cutting a deal like right before he leaves office. Like we use him for what we needed to right now.
Yeah.
And then 3 years later, he'll give him like, hey, you're kicked out of the country. Go live in Russia next to Assad.
Yeah. I thought about that too. I mean, I think at the end of the day, it's not about putting him in jail for the rest of his life. It's about asserting the power to get what the bigger picture accomplished, to get the bigger goal accomplished.
Yeah. Because the arrangement that the status quo arrangement has been made with China through next autumn. Mm-hmm. And so in the spring, Trump's traveling to China to visit, later in the year, Chinese guys coming back to the US. Well, those parties are negotiating the new arrangement that's going to govern the world economic order for, let's say, the next 50 years. Mm-hmm. Well, you don't want to come to the table being the weaker of the two negotiating parties because the other side knows they can cripple us.
Right.
So now Trump's coming back saying, well, yeah, you can hurt us with the rare earths, but we're already developing our own source of supply for rare earths. Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, we'll just starve you because we won't allow nobody to sell you food.
Yep. Or oil or silver or gold or anything else.
Well, no, they can replace the oil.
Well, yeah.
But now you see them also like threatening Iran because that's another big supplier. So if Iran falls, Venezuela's already fallen, like China's starting to get surrounded by countries whose resources we control.
Right.
And so that's the naked power that's being exercised like behind the scenes where, like I said earlier, Trump can come in acting magnanimously. Of course, he said it earlier. Of course, we're going to sell oil to China. I want to sell more. Mm-hmm. Yeah, of course. So long as the Chinese know, you can buy all the oil you want to, as long as you go and talk to Trump and abide by the restrictions that the American government puts in place. And so as a non-knee-jerk Trump supporter, I'm willing to admit that the move on multiple dimensions was brilliant. Like you always hear knuckleheads in the administration saying they're playing multi-dimensional chess, 4D chess. Mm-hmm. This was actually 4D chess.
Yeah. And I had no idea this was that in depth, and that's why I wanted to bring you on to kind of explain it. And as always, you did a phenomenal job. Thank you for shedding some light on this. I think a lot of people get a lot of good information out of this, and I look forward to seeing if some of your hunches are right. If we do go into Mexico by the end of the year and just seeing how this plays out, I think we're in line. Definitely. I think they're going to have to do something to smooth this over with Russia. But I'm kind of curious of what you said if they do wind up going into Mexico by the end of the year.
Well, remember that what I believe is going to happen, rather than us having to go in, the Mexican government's going to do it.
Submit. Okay.
No, the Mexican government's going to
go in themselves.
Remember, yeah, because look, understand, the Mexican political system is very much like the Venezuelans,
right?
Except they didn't go as far. Like the Mexican government isn't green lighting loading the planes on the cargo on the airplanes,
right?
They sell impunity, but the Mexican system is fractured. You've got multiple political parties, so every party has within their coalition drug organizations. So if you're being protected by the pre-political party, law enforcement associated with the pan-political party is targeting you. Like one group can't get protection from everybody.
I gotcha.
That's why they got to stay in their own little regions. Now, the Mexican government does not want unilateral military action on Mexican soil. That's an enormous lever. So now the Mexican government can either go to the cartels, all of whom are already in bed with different political parties, and say, hey, look, we don't care about the coke. We don't care about the crystal. Stop the fenny.
Yep.
And more importantly, stop extorting minors. Because the United States government is not going to allow China to break a resource embargo because China was able to activate Chinese organized crime to work with the guys in Mexico they're already doing business with. To source resources because the Chinese will pay a $12 or $15 per ounce premium. So when you rip off, when Jalisco extorts a mining company for 5 million ounces of silver this year, well, they get an extra $75 million on those 5 million ounces by selling it to the Chinese rather than to the Americans. Well, the United States is not going to tolerate that. And so either the Mexican government is going to be incentivized to exercise their influence over the cartels to get them to back away from the Feni and stop interfering with the American hegemonic resource program, or the Mexican government's going to do it themselves.
Right.
Because don't think for a moment the Mexican government can't stomp out every one of these cartels. They just don't do so because they're pigs eating at the narco trough.
Yeah, it's not financially beneficial right now.
Yeah, it's not financially in their interest. Now, by increasing the threat, either in the form of tariffs, which the Mexican government knows Trump isn't going to do because it would only hurt our own economy.
Right.
And so he was always threatening military action, but they're like, nah, he's probably not going to do it. Well, after Maduro, they like, you know what, he may do it.
Yeah, now,
now they're going to that's where the leverage comes in.
Yeah.
And the Mexican government's like, hey, look, we're not going to have them topple us. We're not going to have them have their troops on here. They don't want, Predator drones shooting rockets into Guadalajara.
Mm-hmm.
And so quietly behind the scenes, you're going to see an influence campaign by the Mexican government with respect to the cartels. Stay away from the mining. Stop interfering with American trucking. Stop with the synthetic opioids. Make your money on the coke. Make your money on the crystal. Like earlier in the year, there was a big report in the LA Times how the Trump administration had essentially said, look, we're prepared to accept the coke and the crystal. Just the marijuana. It is what it is. That's a law enforcement matter.
I think we covered that on our one of the last
on an earlier one. Yeah. Well, that's essentially going to be the proposal that's presented. And so when you hear Trump making statements, we got to do something about Mexico next, he's incentivizing the Mexican government to exercise their influence. Alternately, exercising the Mexican government to exercise their military power. In the end, if none of that happens, then the U.S. will have to act unilaterally. And while, of course, they're going to couch it as counter narcotics, it's primarily going to be over silver.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Pete. I appreciate you coming on, my friend. It's been a treat as always.
Okay. Thank you for having me. Have a good evening.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, that'll do it for this episode of Crime and Entertainment. That was Pete Rausini. I'm Hollywood Wade. We'll see you next week.